This panel is entitled Integrating Approaches to Regional Innovation. The CHIPS and Science Act authorized bold new initiatives to stimulate innovative activities in America's regions. EDA's Regional Technology and Innovation Hub program, for example, NSF's Technology and Innovation Partnerships Directorate, and the Department of Defense's Microelectronics Commons programs represent new and integrated approaches to stimulate innovation in several high-tech industries that are critical to our national and economic security. Through various authorities and funding approaches, each is promoting the creation and use of regional collaboratives across sectors to build a network ecosystem of public, private, and academic partners that will accelerate commercialization of chips and related technologies, as well as stimulate research, development, and commercialization of other important technologies and industries. Each of our speakers will provide their perspectives on what I term the emergence and development of regional technology and innovation commons. Our first speaker today is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development. Alejandra Castillo is the current Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, and in this role, she leads the U.S. Economic Development Administration and is responsible for fulfilling the Bureau's mission of leading the federal economic development agenda. Previously, in 2014, Alejandra was appointed by President Obama to serve as National Director of the Commerce Department's Minority Business Development Agency, becoming the first Hispanic woman to lead the agency. Immediately prior to President Biden appointing her to lead EDA, Castillo was Chief Executive Officer of YWCA USA, where she championed the 163-year-old organization and its 204 associations, serving over 2.3 million women and families across 1,300 communities in the United States. So I'd like to invite Assistant Secretary Castillo to come up and provide us with some opening remarks.
Good morning. First of all, thank you very much, Tom. Not only are you an incredible professional, but also I consider you a dear friend as well, and for the great work that you did at EDA. So I know that EDA is deep in your heart. I want to thank CSIS for convening us, for having this conversation. Not only is it timely, but it is truly a moment in time to be the futurists, so to speak, of our country. To be able to wear a hat that seldomly we're able to wear because we're trying to solve the problems of yesterday without having the opportunity, the bandwidth, the leeway, the funding to think long term. Allow me to also take a moment of privilege to thank Phil Singerman, who is in the audience as well. And thank you, Phil. Phil served also as Assistant Secretary of EDA and is someone who knows EDA very well. So we have incredible champions for the Economic Development Administration, but I always start these conversations by giving context because EDA is part of the Department of Commerce, right? And Commerce has 13 different agencies. And I say that because all of those 13 different agencies really work together to create these ecosystems. So think about not only the Census Bureau with the data that they have, think about National Institute of Standards and Technology, and we have our colleague here from NIST, who is definitely leading this important moment in time with regards to CHIPS and Science Act. But also think about NTIA, National Telecommunication and Information Agency, $48 billion to invest in broadband. Think about NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and how we are not only thinking about climate change, but the data that NOAA produces to make sure that our citizens and our populations are safe when it comes to hurricanes and tornadoes and so much that's happening. Think about the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, making sure that we are not only creating the technology and innovation, but that we're also producing patents, that we're protecting our intellectual property, and many others that I can go on and on. But I say that because I want you to also, let's also recommit ourselves to what Senator Young said, This is about people, places, and possibilities. People, places, and possibilities. And while, yes, the CHIPS component of the CHIPS and Science Act is tremendously important, both of the senators that you heard previously mentioned something very important, which is not only do we need to focus on that particular industry, but we need to also focus on the ecosystem that builds, as President Biden says, from the bottom up, middle out. And I have to say, and I think you may have heard me say this before, this is remarkable to be able to have 4 pieces of legislation that President Biden has signed into law that all kind of focus very intentionally on taking our country to the next level of technology innovation. You have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, you have the CHIPS and Science Act, you have the Inflation Reduction Act. And when we think about all of these different initiatives, we also have to think about what the American Rescue Plan did as well. So 4 pieces of legislation, all truly focused on how do we help people, communities, not just rebuild from the pandemic, but leapfrog in so many ways. As you probably heard from Senator Kelly, I live out of a suitcase in so many ways because this job, as Phil reminds me, is about getting out there, being able to see and witness what is happening across the country. And yes, there is this use of this derogatory term of flyover states. But when you go to places like Indiana, like Kentucky, like Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, so many places, you see the assets that are on the ground. And I know that we're going to take a minute to talk about tech hubs, or more than a minute. I know everyone is very, very focused on tech hubs, but before I talk about tech hubs, I also want to remind you that we also have a second program that EDA is developing, and that's called Recompete. We have Tech Hub on one side and Recompete on the other, and both are essential to make sure that we can jumpstart what's happening across America. Recompete will focus on locations that are highly distressed with prime age employment gaps and really bringing in those funds. But also, what we have learned and how we are now doing economic development grants is that we now can appreciate the value of bringing partnerships and coalitions. So Recompete will follow that model, and so will tech hubs. The legislation, if you see the legislation, if you read the legislation, and I encourage you to read it, it's 10 pages long, but it is the cliff notes of what tech hubs is. And it requires the creation of consortia, requires the engagement and involvement of universities and community colleges and nonprofit organizations and philanthropy and private sector. It requires all of these entities and stakeholders to come to the table and really think about what are the assets on the ground, where are the industries that they believe, that the community believes they are best suited to pursue. And that model has shown or has proven to be very successful. And the reason I say that is because, as many of you may know, just last year we issued $3 billion in different types of grants under the American Rescue Plan. And one of those grants was the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. And I am personally calling on a regular basis all of our 21 winners. And what we have noticed is, yes, there were those 21s that were successful, but there were others that may not have been successful in terms of getting the dollars, but were successful in taking those partnerships to the next level. And we're getting some incredible responses of how important just the fact that EDA is incentivizing these partnerships. Just to close, I will invite you to truly pay attention at the EDA, what the Economic Development Administration is doing. In the next 45 days, you will see a number of notice of funding opportunities, including tech hubs. I know that there's a lot of excitement, and there should be a lot of excitement, because truly, I've lived in this town for a very long time, and this is something I have never witnessed. But I'm going to borrow from the words of Senator Young. This is the moment where all of you have a voice. Yes, Tech Hubs was authorized at $10 billion. However, it was appropriated in the omnibus bill at $500 million. It's great. It's a down payment. I'll take it. But it's not enough to move the needle in the way that we and our nation deserves. So your voices, the voices of all these different stakeholders, is going to be essential and critical as you talk to your members of Congress. I know that Tom will make this a very robust conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. But I leave you with this. The moment for not only economic development is now. The moment to ensure that our national security is well protected and well developed is now. The moment to make sure that people and places are visible. I will submit to you that while this is also about economic development and national security, it's also about our democracy. If we don't invest in those places that feel left behind, it frays our democracy. This is an opportunity not just to jumpstart different industries, the industries of tomorrow, but also to make sure that we are investing in those places that have so much to offer. So I want to leave you with that. It's more of a tug at the heart, because I know you're all incredibly smart people, but this too is important. That notion of how do we rebuild our democracy, how do we allow folks to have a decent job, and it's very empowering to me. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion with the panel. Thanks again.
Thank you, Secretary Castillo. Our next speaker is Erwin Gianchandani. He is the Assistant Director for the U.S. National Science Foundation's Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, leading the newly established TIP Directorate. Prior to becoming the Assistant Director for TIP, he served as Senior Advisor for Translation, Innovation, and Partnerships, where he helped to develop plans for the new TIP Directorate in collaboration with colleagues at NSF, including other government agencies, industry, and academia in that planning effort. During the previous 6 years, Gianchandani was the NSF Deputy Assistant Director for Computer and Information Science and Engineering, twice serving as Acting Assistant Director. He holds a PhD in Biomedical Engineering from the University of Virginia. In 2021, Dr. Gianchandani received the Distinguished Presidential Rank Award, awarded to members of the federal government's Senior Executive Service for sustained extraordinary accomplishment. Dr. Gianchandani.
All right, good morning, everybody. Oh, come on, we can do better than that. Good morning, everybody. There we go. Excellent. So first of all, Tom, thanks very much for that kind introduction, and my thanks to CSIS for organizing this event. I think this is a fabulous opportunity for us to really have an in-depth conversation about issues that are really at the heart of what we all care about passionately when it comes to being able to think about innovation and entrepreneurship and talent creation and impact, positive impact on society in every corner of our country. So I recognize some faces around the room, but I certainly don't recognize everyone, and I imagine that some of you are less familiar with the National Science Foundation as part of the federal government. NSF has been around as a federal agency for more than 70 years, and in that time we have stewarded investments in basic research in all different areas of science and engineering, and contributed to the devices that we all walk around with today, the resources that we use online to be able to do searching, to MRIs and barcodes and all kinds of other technologies that we rely upon in our day-to-day lives. Having said that, I think that the reason we're all here today is because the NSF of today is not the NSF of 20, 30, even 10, even 5 years ago, potentially. The CHIPS and Science Act for us, and I certainly agree with everything that Assistant Secretary Castillo said about the breadth of legislation that was passed over the course of the last 6, 9, 12 months or so. But for us at NSF, the CHIPS and Science Act in particular is seminal. And the reason it's so important to us is because that legislation, in addition to the billions of dollars that were appropriated for chips and trying to ensure that the U.S. reshores chip manufacturing and so forth, in addition to all of that, that legislation authorized the establishment of this new directorate at the National Science Foundation called Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. The first time, in fact, in more than 3 decades that NSF has stood up a new directorate. So this is certainly not something that we take lightly, and it's not something that we do every day. And in many ways, as you heard the senators speak about earlier, this is a generational opportunity for us at NSF, but it's also a generational opportunity for all of us all across the country. And the reason, I think in many ways, that this legislation came to be, and you heard the senators speak to this, is that from a national competitiveness perspective, we as a nation face intense global competition in a number of different technology areas. Semiconductors, yes, but artificial intelligence, advanced wireless, biotechnology, quantum information science, the list goes on. We also recognize that we face socioeconomic challenges today that are prevailing and that are driving a number of factors in our daily lives, whether it be the climate or critical infrastructure or issues of equity and inequity when it comes to access to education and healthcare and so forth. And at the same time, I think that we have, as a federal government, as an agency at NSF, invested heavily in research and development, but perhaps not equitably across the country. And there are a lot of millions of Americans who are missing from the STEM enterprise that drives our nation's economy on a day-to-day basis. And so those 3 factors, that global competition, that socioeconomic set of challenges that we face, the missing millions, those 3 factors, together with the fact that our research enterprise in and of itself is evolving. We see that the pace of discovery in science and engineering is increasing with access to data and sensing and other capabilities. We see that today's early career researchers and students care a lot about coming into STEM so that they can make a positive impact on society. They saw what transpired with the COVID vaccines and how science was at the root of that, and they want to be able to, in their own way, shape positively outcomes. And where that talent ends up is increasingly distributed. No longer just at our institutions of higher education, but in industry, in government, in nonprofits. And so it's incumbent upon us to catalyze the partnerships that bring together these varied perspectives to help address some of these challenges. And so those factors together in many ways is what we believe leads us to this paradigm expansion moment. Folks often call it a paradigm shift. I'm going to call it a paradigm expansion moment for us here in the U.S. and for us at the National Science Foundation. We have invested heavily for 70 plus years in researchers at academic institutions who do great work, and then we try to push the research results out into the market and into society. And what we need to do increasingly is bring that constellation of the users, the beneficiaries of that research to the table to help shape the research agenda that we're going to pursue, to help motivate the research questions, to work collaboratively hand in glove with the researchers. And so in some sense, that market is now coming to the table and demanding or pulling out the research results at the end of the day. So a little bit of a paradigm expansion from us from strictly tech push to much more market demand. And that, in many ways, is the essence of what we're trying to do with the TIP Directorate at NSF, to really hone in on use-inspired research, to hone in on being able to accelerate the translation of research to practice in meaningful ways. And when we do that, we too have a flagship effort that Alejandra and I have talked a lot about because of the synergies between our effort and the tech hubs. We call it the Regional Innovation Engines Program. And for us, the Engines Program, if you think about the engines and the tech hubs, they are going to work together at the end of the day. The engines starting from a place of research and feeding forward to be able to bring together that ecosystem in a particular region, to put that region on the map for a particular technology area or a particular societal or economic impact area that is that region's potential for competitive advantage relative to other parts of the country. And to, in many ways, engage parts of the country, those regions that frankly have been left behind for too long, but where there is clear and pressing evidence of folks who can come together, who have shared interests, who have expertise that can be honed and shaped, if only we were to provide the resourcing and we were to provide the framework to be able to enable that effectively. And in many ways, these engines we see as feeding into the tech hubs that our colleagues at EDA and Commerce are looking to stand up. And so the Regional Innovation Engines for NSF serves as a flagship effort with significant investment that we hope Congress will continue to bestow upon us as we move forward. But it serves as one of those flagship investments, focused around use-inspired research and trying to be able to build capacity and really engage diverse talent from all corners of the country. We also care a lot about building up translational capacity. You heard the senators talking about that earlier, about their experience at Arizona State or University of Arizona and Indiana and elsewhere. Well, it's incumbent upon us to create opportunities at universities to have the capacity, to have the structural support so that folks can really take part in that translational activity and help get research results out into the market and society more rapidly than we're doing today. And we have an effort that we've launched around accelerating research translation to build that capacity at institutions of higher education that maybe have strong fundamental research efforts, but not as strong translational efforts today in the moment. And then finally, the third piece of this that's so important to us is around talent creation. You heard the Assistant Secretary talk about it. It's about people at the end of the day. And it's about allowing opportunities, whether those be practical experiences, whether it be mechanisms for internships or apprenticeships. How do we give opportunities for talent at all levels? We're known as an agency that supports graduate students, but we need to think about our community colleges, a treasure trove of talent in our country, diverse talent. We need to think about four-year schools. We need to think about individuals who are in the workforce today who may be interested in doing a pivot into a high-tech trade space if only they had the opportunity to be able to experience what that looks like. So we've launched an effort called Experiential Learning for Emerging and Novel Technologies to start to take the first steps to be able to do just that. So at the end of the day, you're hearing this a lot this morning. This is definitely our moment, but it requires all of us working together to be able to seize that moment. We can't do it just the two of us. We can't do it just those of us who are in the room today. It requires the entire nation to really come together in lockstep to be able to move in this direction. And if we do that, we will be able to not only accelerate technology competitiveness for the nation, but we will do so in a way that takes advantage of one of our unique and I think pressing opportunities for competitive advantage vis-a-vis other nations in the world, which is the diversity that exists all across the country. If only we can harness the geography of innovation and the demography of innovation. As my boss, the director, likes to say at NSF, this is about creating opportunities everywhere, and it's about inspiring innovation anywhere. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Gianchandani. Our third speaker is Dr. Alison Smith. Dr. Smith is the Microelectronics Commons Technical Director. The Commons is within the Microelectronics Principal Director's portfolio in the Deputy Chief Technology Office for Critical Technologies within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Prior to the Commons Technical Director position, Dr. Smith was a member of the Defense Microelectronics cross-functional team, where she led the microelectronics workforce development strategy. From 2016 to 2020, she served as the inaugural Chief Engineer of Materials Analysis for the Microelectronics Component Technologies of the Naval Surface Warfare Center, Crane Division. She is the 2018 recipient of the Samuel J. Heyman Award, commonly known as the Sammys, to those of you who are in the federal service, for her work in the area of nano-architectural design. She holds a doctorate in materials chemistry from Indiana University. Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Tom. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, CSIS, for organizing this discussion about regional impacts. So I do have to provide a disclaimer before beginning, because Microelectronics Commons is in source selection. The request for solutions, or RFS, closed in late February, so there are some topics such as proposers and specific topics that were proposed that will be off the table. But there are lots of things that I can share, and we are looking forward to announcing the Microelectronics Commons hubs in August of this year. So I clicked and nothing's happening. There we go. Oh, it went twice. All right, so let's talk about Microelectronics Commons. The Commons aims to enable lab-to-fab prototyping in domestic facilities. So it's an onshore lab-to-fab capability. At the same time, it aims to develop that talent pipeline in parallel. And so currently, researchers such as universities, startups, other innovators in that ecosystem face a lot of barriers to demonstrating manufacturing in a lab, right? But demonstrating at-scale viability is required to move from an idea to full realization of that idea. All right, and so these core facilities, or fabs and foundries, provide access to early stage fab prototyping, but again, those sources of innovation oftentimes face barriers to accessing those. And so what Commons aims to do is to evolve those lab prototypes to fab prototypes, and again, at the same time, develop that talent pipeline for the 6 technical areas that you see on either side of that slide. Those areas are critical to the Department of Defense, so Commons will be supporting that lab to fab prototype development of microelectronics hardware for those 6 technical areas. That includes things like materials, processes, architectures, as well as devices. And so I discussed that there were a number of barriers for, those innovators to have access to that lab prototyping capability. So one of the things that Commons aims to do is to lower that barrier so that we can have democratized access to the capabilities needed for lab to fab prototyping. It is very important and especially relevant, since we're here today to talk about the regional ecosystems, for us to look at who we're reaching out to, right? And so we do that from day one. Are the bulk of the folks who are interacting with us through innovation days, through industry days, are they non-traditional defense partners, right? Or are they traditional? Are they coming from small business sectors or big business? And also, are they coming from academia or others? So, we really need to ensure that those folks who need that access are going to be able to have that access. And so when I talk about innovation barriers, there are many, but I will just mention a few. The very high cost of digital infrastructure, such as electronic design automation tools. A lack of access, as I mentioned, to fabs for that lab-to-fab prototyping, and then also a lack currently of a workforce talent and expertise needed to support that ultimately technology transition. And so what success looks like for Commons is that we have sustained partnerships. That is between these emerging technology sources and the manufacturers, as well as our interagency partners. And so I think the key word there is really sustained, right? We heard Senator Kelly say this is about long-term competitiveness of the regions. And we also heard Senator Young say it's about connecting those collaborators. And he also talked about needing to leverage our allies. So when we're talking about sustained, long-term, regional innovation hubs, those regional innovation hubs have to partner with national or even international, right, collaborators to fully be a center of technical excellence in one of those 6 areas I had shown earlier. And so I think that that's very important, because while we're talking about building these regional communities, what kind of access are we providing them? Not just the physical infrastructure, but also this human infrastructure, but also community building, right? So not just human infrastructure in the terms of who are the folks working in that hub and providing services out to the users to execute lab to fab, but what about collaboration pipelines and these connections to the collaborators? Regionally, nationally, globally. And so I know that if my boss were here, he would say sustained, 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 right? Sustained is that key word there with the partnerships. But the other thing that marks success is rapid transition of technology. Right? It's not going to be just that evolution of a lab prototype to a fab prototype, but we have to do so rapidly. And at the same time, we have to expand that domestic microelectronics fabrication capability and enhance our regional microelectronics education to bolster those engineering workforce and ultimately also bolster those regional economies. And so finally, we see like this investment that's required, right? When I said it's a huge barrier for them to overcome these again, these small startups, right? These sources of innovation, these universities to overcome these high costs required to go from lab to fab. This is what I'm talking about. S&T, right? Early stage S&T is not nearly as expensive as we move into this lab to fab transition. And that is the part that Commons is intending to help bridge. The highlighted section that you see there, and I know that Dr. Shnoy often says, this is not lab to market. Commons is about lab to fab. And so if you go to the far right, you see we also have to build these communities and these connection points with DoD programs such as demonstrators, also the Defense Industrial Base, our interagency partners, and commercial industry, because there has to be that handoff for further development, as we talked about today. And as many of the people have talked about today in regards to technology transfer, but also want to say that we work and we coordinate very closely with Commerce on the NSTC, as the NSTC does support later stage technology readiness levels, including to commercial market. And so with that, I want to thank everyone, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you all. Wonderful opening remarks from each of you. And so I'd like to kick off our part of the conversation with a couple of follow-up questions. First, Erwin, I'll start with you and just ask you to proceed around. But each of your programs and initiatives envision regional hubs to innovate and develop technologies to achieve national economic and security goals. what are the broad indicators of success to you? And also, sort of a second part maybe is even to dive down maybe another level, are there any one or two specific key indicators that you would like to see from your regional partners to report on as they work with your agencies to build their innovation commons?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thanks, Tom, for that. I think we all spend a lot of our time thinking about success indicators and so forth, and I'm grateful that you use the term indicators. Folks oftentimes use the phrase metrics, right? And while we can debate and litigate about metrics all we want, at the end of the day, I think it is about trying to be able to take stock a year in, 2 years in, 3 years in. Are the indicators trending in the right direction? So I'll speak first for the Engines program, and I think that my colleagues can speak for the various flagship investments that they have as well. NSF is often known as an agency that supports research, right? Basic research. And the coin of the realm when it comes to research is papers and publications and conference proceedings and so forth. And while these engines start from a place of research, and so we would expect to see some of that, we're really looking at the end of the day at what is the impact? What is the impact of the investment that we're trying to make? So some examples in that dimension. Who are the partners who are coming together? What is the diversity of perspectives that are coming together in a meaningful and coherent way for a particular engine? When I think about those partners, are they providing perspective to help shape the agenda for that particular engine? Are they in there helping to do piloting and prototyping of some of the research results? Are they engaging to help draw out the research results to have impact in that particular region? We need to think more about both the technological outputs that we're seeing and how those are translating into patents and licenses and new startups, how we're seeing potential follow-on funding. I love the conversation on the previous panel about venture capital and other follow-on investment that needs to come to the table. That is too concentrated today in certain pockets in our country. And if we are able to stand up successful engines, that we hope will serve as a draw, as a lure, as an enticement for some of those VCs and others to start to diversify some of them are doing it, but to further diversify their portfolios with these engines. So technological outputs and some of those indicators that I just talked about are top of mind for us. And then there's a strong workforce component to this. I cannot stress that enough. We should not think about this as strictly about research or technology. We should be thinking about it as the people whom we're training. And when we think about people that we're training, I think it's imperative for us to think about that as at all levels. So you think about a workforce on the fab floor, for instance. They're technicians, they're practitioners, they're researchers, they're entrepreneurs, right? We also need to think about the teachers who need to be trained to or get professional development so that they can be ready to teach to industrial, relevant, and rigorous and engaging curriculum of the future. So what does that talent creation look like in terms of the outputs of individuals and how those individuals are diverse and reflective of the population of a particular region? So those are some of the indicators that I think we're thinking about.
Great, thank you.
Erwin said it beautifully and accurately. A couple of things I want to just underscore. When we hear the word tech hubs, in the past it's been a building, right? A place, a very distinct and discrete place, and we call it a tech hub. This program is not that. This program is about regional economic development, regional technology and innovation engagement. And regions can be, it's not just the city or the city limits or even the state limits. We're looking at truly much broader areas of the country that can come together in a shared vision with an understanding of particular industries that they believe are going to drive growth. But as Erwin said, I agree wholeheartedly. How comprehensive, how holistic are the consortia that will be created here? How authentic are they? Are they just coming together to pursue this grant? Are they really coming together to ensure that their community is at the forefront of that talent pipeline, at the forefront of tech transfer, hopefully at the forefront of entrepreneurship, of creating that next generation of supply chain or suppliers? So there are many indicators that we're looking at, and universities are going to play a very important role, but they're not the only entity. Community colleges are going to play a role, nonprofit organizations. The state is going to play a role. The city is going to play a role. And I say that because we could get very lost with talking about $10 billion, which is what it's been authorized at least in the case of tech hubs. But that's not going to be enough. We need to incentivize the state to be a partner. And we're seeing that in many places with regards to Build Back Better. So there is a willingness at the state level, at the regional level. And I'll also say that you mentioned, Erwin, the creation of patents. That's why I mentioned that USPTO is part of commerce. That is one of the indicators that we're looking at. And just to end this particular answer is, we are thinking about tech hubs to not just start, grow, but also to retain companies here in the US. We don't want to do the same thing we did in the past where, yes, we were leaders in the semiconductor industry, but it all went abroad. We want to also make sure that we have conditions and incentives on the ground for companies to start, grow, and remain in the US. Yep.
Well, there's not much left to add after that. But I just want to reiterate, it would be the evolution of prototypes, right? Are these technologies maturing? How rapid are they maturing? As Erwin mentioned, is there follow-up, right? Is there follow-up investment, right? These technologies, once they've matured to a certain TRL, they have to be matured further all the way to market. And so that's very important, tracking the workforce. Are we developing the workforce that we need? And I think this was already mentioned too, but I really think that it's a critical piece. Who are the partners, right? Who is playing in this ecosystem? Yeah.
Great, thank you. Alejandra, I'll start with you, and we'll look at the other side of it, in part because early keywords, partnerships, collaboration, things that we encourage, but truthfully in the day-to-day world we live in, not always easy to do. So what do you see as potential threats or barriers to success in a region as it develops its technology and innovation commons?
Sure. So again, as was mentioned before, we're taking a two-step approach to tech hubs, particularly on the side of how this program is going to be administered. One is the first phase is looking at tech hubs with regards to both the consortia, but also providing some planning grants. So that's and I mention that because we are very aware that if we want to be as support the success of this program, we need to build capacity on the ground, right? And currently, we've mentioned all of these different types of funding streams that are coming from the federal government, but we also have to acknowledge that at times, at the local level, we need to build capacity. So that's one thing in terms of, I don't see it as a barrier, but I think we are very alert that that is a challenge. The second thing is making sure that the partners are coming to the table in a very authentic way, that we're able to have various voices, going back to the equity piece, who's represented and who's not represented. So we want to make sure that, again, we're moving these coalitions in ways that are engaging as many different stakeholders as possible. And then the third thing I would say, again, not looking at it as a challenge, but looking at it as a possibility and a place where we as government can do better, is helping these areas or these regions blend and braid other types of funding, whether it's working with NSF in some aspect of the spectrum, or working with Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, working with national labs. We haven't spoken about national labs, and they are too a very critical piece to that. So again, I want to be as optimistic as possible. What we can see as barriers, I think there's opportunities there for partners across the federal government to support at the ground level how these regional tech hubs are going to be forming.
Yeah, I just would like to follow up on the equity piece, because it is the number one topic of feedback from the offer community when we talk about the hubs themselves, right? They often ask, how is it that we are going to have a fair and equitable say-so in the projects that we will execute? How can I be guaranteed that my ideas will be heard, and that we don't just have the heavy hitters, right, of a regional innovation hub running everything? And the answer to that is that we require governance structures that are indeed fair, but I think that that is something we will have to closely monitor so that we ensure the goal there is democratize access, right? And so I think it's our responsibility that we monitor that and ensure that that is actually executed throughout these hubs.
So I'll just be brief, since my colleagues have I think hit on some of the very key points that I would have hit as well. I'll just double down on 2 or 3 things. One is capacity building. So we talk about partnerships, we talk about the genuineness of those partnerships, the meaningfulness of those partnerships. I think any team that is trying to pull together a regional innovation engine or a regional tech hub or a component to the Microelectronics Commons, any of these teams is going to require support structures to be able to stitch together the meaningfulness of the partnership, to be able to understand, how do I down the road secure additional follow-on funding, to be able to learn from one another's best practices, to be able to understand that an output from one engine or tech hub might actually benefit another engine or tech hub, for example. And so I think trying to put in place the support structures that maximize the chances of success for any of these teams is something that's really imperative. It's why we've actually taken the step of launching a builder platform in the last couple of weeks to help teams build, right? It's a platform to help teams build their engines or their eventually tech hubs or what have you down the road as well. So that's number one. The second point that I'll highlight, and it's very related to that, I agree with everything that was said about equity, but I'm going to focus on sustainability long term. And there's sustainability in the region, so federal funds cannot be the basis for success 20 years down the road, right? We're going to provide funding for a period of time. There needs to be a gradual ramp down of the federal funding and a gradual ramp up of whatever sustainment looks like. And so I think it's not a barrier. It's just something that we all need to have our eyes on as we think about this from the very beginning, because too often we make investments and then worry about the sustainment later on down the road. And there's sustainment at the local and regional level. There's also sustainment at the federal level too. And Alejandra touched on this in her opening remarks, so I don't think I need to say much more than what she said, other than to say, these programs, our colleagues on the Hill who were here earlier, by definition want to see success as quickly as possible. Success breeds further investment, breeds further success. But these things do take time. And so as much as we have momentum and wind at our backs, we also need, I think, a certain degree of patience from everyone involved and a recognition that these do require that sustained investment over the long haul.
Alison, you highlighted a key term, another set of keywords that we've heard this morning from all of you as panelists as well as from the senators. These words include democratization, diversity, inclusion, and you addressed that, and I'm really happy to hear how you addressed that. So I actually want to go to you two and ask you to talk a little bit about how do we ensure that these investments are inclusive and bring real opportunity to those individuals and communities who don't possess the same advantages as existing innovation centers. How do we assure that can happen?
So I'll take a couple of things. First of all, as you know, we at EDA included equity as one of our primary investment priorities. You can visit our website. It's not just in words, it's also in practice. When we look at the broad scope of grants that EDA reviews, we are looking at equity. You will also probably see equity as a key selection criteria as well. The engagement of the consortia or the partnership. So equity is in everything that we do. How do we ensure that? First of all, we have to communicate. This is not necessarily the issues that are spoken about at the kitchen table in many of our households. We need to not only communicate, inform, empower people to see themselves in what we're all doing, right? Technology innovation, industries of tomorrow. And that's a lot of my job is to go to communities, to expand on it. I was in Indiana with you and the senator, making sure that all communities are hearing this message and also hearing this opportunity. I've been to Northern Flagstaff where I met with Hopi tribe. So looking at, as I mentioned before, not just the usual stakeholders, but asking ourselves the question, who's missing at this table? Who needs to be part of this table? Just a thing that I want to underscore that Erwin said, and Tom, you know this very well. You know, economic development is not episodic. It needs to be, as Alison mentioned, long-term, sustainable. So not only is our educational campaign, so to speak, with folks outside of Washington, D.C., it's also with our members of Congress. Because you're absolutely right, Erwin. Everyone wants to see the success very quickly. I also wanted to say that with regards to equity, it's the realization of how our country's population is changing. Hence why I also mentioned that the Census Bureau is part of commerce. We are engaging the Census Bureau to make sure that we are looking at these regions, pockets of population, making sure that we're engaging them and helping them see themselves as an essential part of the future of our country. So a lot of work. Again, this is not an episodic, let's just go out and do this one time. It has to be consistent. It has to be sustainable. And more importantly, we need to take this very seriously. Equity is not a word. It has to be a verb. It has to be something that we do in all the programs that we have. And that's been the commitment of the Biden administration. One of the president's first executive order was to make sure that we're looking at equity across the board. Yep.
So I'll just add to some of what the Assistant Secretary said. I resonate with everything that she just said. I think from our perspective, when we launched the Engines program, which, by the way, it didn't occur to me until I was driving here this morning, we launched the program exactly a year ago today, as it turns out. And we are on the cusp of being able to announce the first round of awards for the Type 1s, the planning or developmental awards, as we call them. Even before we launched the program, we had a series of listening sessions with diverse institution types. We talked to HBCUs, we talked to HSIs, we talked to tribal colleges and universities, we talked to two-year universities, community colleges, and technical schools. And we did that because we wanted to try to ensure that we had a better understanding of the perspectives that these diverse institution types can bring to the table and can bring to an effort like the Regional Innovation Engines program. And we tried to infuse into the funding opportunity that we issued a year ago today, language that speaks to some of the challenges, some of the pain points that have historically prevented these diverse institution types from being able to engage in federal funding opportunities, let alone in something as large and significant as an engine type program. So starting from even before we launched the program, to then how we wrote the funding opportunity, to then how we conducted the review process or are conducting the review process for some of the Type 2s, the larger, fuller engines that we hope to award later this year. You know, at each step of the way, we've tried to design in, if you will, from the start, a consideration of diversity and equity and inclusivity and accessibility into everything that we're doing and how we're shaping it and structuring it. It's actually part of the reason why we did two things with this program. Number one, we put out a call for both Type 1s and Type 2s, so planning activities as well as full-fledged engines. There are some communities, there are some regions, there are some partnerships and coalitions that are ready today to jump full throttle ahead into an engine activity. And then there are others that need more time and more resourcing and capacity building structures to better position themselves for that fuller engine competition. And so it was intentional in that regard, number one. And the second thing, something that NSF did with this program that we never do. I was so proud of the agency to take this step, right? That we put out a call for concept outlines from the community, 3-page write-ups if you were interested in a Type 1, 5-page write-ups if you were interested in a Type 2. So not a lot of effort. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's effort. It's a lot of effort. But not as much effort as a 15-page or 20-page proposal might require, right? To just get the word out there about this is the team that's coming together in early days, this is the concept, and this is the region of service that we're exploring potentially having impact in. And we then published all of those concept outlines, close to 700 of them. And we did that with the intention of, yes, drawing a buzz to the program, of course, but more importantly, being able to say that if I'm a community college in this region and I'm a 4-year R1 institution in this region and I'm a company in this region and all three of us are, turns out, working in the same technology space and working in a relatively similar region, let's encourage teaming, let's encourage partnering. Let's worry a little bit less about who is the lead for the effort and more about who are the partners who are coming together, because you need those genuine, meaningful partnerships from diverse perspectives to be able to tackle some of these challenges in some of these technology areas. We all know how in certain technology areas it is incumbent upon us to ensure, and really all technology areas, incumbent upon us to ensure that those who are designing the technology and developing the technology are reflective of the population that's going to use that technology. And so that's something that we've tried to ingrain into the DNA, if you will, of this program from the very beginning.
Tom, if I can just piggyback. Erwin, you touched on something very important. The transparency element of how we not only design but implement these programs is very important. And as you know, going after a federal grant is not for the faint of heart. But the fact that we're able to post the applications, the concepts, and for folks to be able to see who's involved, what are the ideas, that brings down the fear, but it also raises the trust that individuals across communities can see themselves, oh, I have a similar idea. I think I can either partner with you or go a different route. So the transparency component in how we're working through these massive programs, these are very large programs, is also a key element on how do we embrace the equity piece.
Great, thank you. Just very quickly, and then we may have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience as well. But Alejandra, you already mentioned partners that you're working with. Do you have any partners, within the federal service, state, local, even international, that you think are important for regions to pay attention to in terms of developing their own expertise and capabilities?
Well, with regards to the regions, yes, they should definitely be partnering across local, state, federal, and other. But for the microelectronics commons planning and the rollout and the intersects, right, with other activities external to commons, we work with NSF, We work with the Department of Commerce, particularly with the NSTC planning. We work with the Department of State as we think about partnering with our allies. And so it's a broad set of interactions across the federal government. But for those people who will be hub leads and within members of hubs, of course, they should be collaborating across all levels.
Great. Anyone else in terms of key partners that are worth mentioning?
You know, we've talked about, maybe the one thing I'll say that we haven't touched on as much is how much we work together within the interagency, right? So we've talked about industry, nonprofits, foundations, state, local, tribal, governmental organizations, economic development entities at those levels. I mean, the list goes on, civic leaders. But I think that we should acknowledge that, you know, I've been in the government or around the government in the government for more than a decade, around the government on and off for almost 2 decades now. And I think the level of collaboration, the level of engagement that we have, this is not the first time we've seen each other in the last few weeks, right? And this is not the first time that many of us have been on a panel together, as a matter of fact, right? But that's publicly facing. That's, you know, internally facing. The number of conversations that we have and our teams have are at an unprecedented level from my perspective. And it's because for this to work, for us to be effective, for us to be able to communicate the story of what we're trying to do with regard to how engines and hubs work together, with regard to how the Microelectronics Commons feeds into this ecosystem, with regard to how some of our other programs and investments also are a part of this. That requires, I think, actual boots on the ground, roll up the sleeves discussions, and starting from the level of how are we going to write it in the funding opportunity, to how are we going to communicate it, to how are we actually going to see some of our investments pave their way to yours and vice versa. So I think that level of engagement, and it's not just our agencies too. When we rolled out the engines program, we got phone calls and emails, we don't do phone calls anymore. We do Zoom calls instead. But we got emails and Zoom calls from a number of other agencies across the federal government that said, hey, we'd love to be able to see how we could dovetail with this opportunity as well.
Great, thank you. We have time for a question or two, maybe. Chuck, if you have a question for our panelists?
Yeah, just very quickly. For NSF representative and of course DOD, we have a program called SBIR.
Yeah.
And while no one's paying attention, it's hit 4.5 billion, which I think you...
We're paying attention. Yeah. We're paying attention to that.
Well, that's actually my question. To what degree you were talking about have the lab to fab and prototyping, and there's been some discussion of perhaps having a more muscular SBIR to provide funding for these promising companies, but also a level of coordination where they would, as you know, it's one of its strengths. It's very diversified across the agencies, particularly yours, but it's an opportunity to focus funds where it's most needed, help de-risk, and then pass forward towards private equity.
And just very quickly for our online audience, the question was about the SBIR program, if you just have a quick answer for Dr.
So
Wessner.
certainly I didn't list all of the pathways or potential pathways for transition out of commons right on the way to market. SBIR is certainly one of those pathways, but there are many.
So I'll just echo what was just said. It's no accident. Maybe the short answer to your question is it's not an accident that when we established the TIP Directorate, into TIP moved programs like SBIR, STTR, Partnerships for Innovation, the NSF I-Corps program, which other agencies have adopted as well to provide entrepreneurial education. We really see this notion of lab to, so we're going to call it market, forgive me, but lab to market, lab to society, right? We really see that as directly tied to the engines that we're trying to stand up and eventually some of these other investments as well. So what we're trying to create is a synergistic set of intertwined programs so that an engine we fund some of the players there might be able to take advantage of the NSF SBIR program. They might be able to take advantage of one of the I-Corps hubs that's in their region, right? So that is absolutely very much a key goal of ours when we think about this portfolio of programs that we're trying to stand up.
Great. Yes, Sujay.
Thank you. Really rich discussion. Secretary Castillo, you mentioned the growing importance of federal and state partnerships. Could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of how these are growing, what some of the challenges are of articulating a more constructive federal-state relationship in these new partnerships as you're describing them? Thank you.
Sure, thank you for the question. And I was going to interject when Tom was asking who are the other partners. I mean, we work with National Governors Association, National Association of Counties and Mayors, the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And I'll give you the answer from what we've seen with, for example, the Build Back Better. The Build Back Better, $1 billion challenge, what we saw was the federal dollars for those who were our finalists, or I should say our awardees, they received anywhere between $25 to $65 million. At the beginning, what we saw was states were saying, if you are successful, we will invest $20 million, $30 million. From where I sit, I was puzzled. I was wondering, why did they make it conditional on winning? After the awards were announced, what we saw and what we continue to see is that now states and the cities are actually investing public dollars as well. Because when the federal government takes that first risk, it generates and incentivizes others to come in. And it's been really fascinating to see, just from the Build Back Better, what's happening and how much excitement is happening on the ground. And we hope that that will be a similar effect with tech hubs. The other thing I would say, and I know we're about to close, is that much of the dollars that you're also seeing with bipartisan infrastructure law and CHIPS is that there's a lot of funding going from the federal government to the states. So in some ways, I invite folks to see that we've had a federal strategy most of the time. Now we need to also engage a state-level strategy. And all of these pools of dollars is what I meant by saying blending and braiding both federal, state, and local dollars to ensure that this is sustainable and successful across the board.
Can I just make one
Sure.
comment? Plus one to everything that the Assistant Secretary said. This is sort of related to your question, but the way in which you answered it inspired me to make this other comment too, which is, I think we agree with this, but we need to do a better job of communicating this to the community and to the nation. We need to rethink the definition of success at the end of the day, right? So we're going to be able to fund some number of engines. You're going to be able to fund some number of tech hubs over time and so forth, right? Microelectronics commons. There are 700 concept outlines. We're not going to be able to fund 700 concepts, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that the ones that we are not funding are failures. They are every bit as much a success. There are only so many dollars that the federal government has access to that can flow out. But those are also success stories, and we are hearing many anecdotal examples of instances where teams have submitted proposals, they're waiting to hear, but they're not necessarily waiting to begin the work because their community, their region is jazzed. And yes, some of the funding may be predicated on what the federal government does first, but some of the intellectual capital and horsepower is already there and ready to go. And I think some of these teams will proceed even if they don't get funding from the federal government. And that is a form of success in terms of the spark that this investment writ large, this legislation, these programs is able to provide.
Great.
Sorry.
Well said, well said.
All good? Okay. Well, we've reached the end of our time, and I'd like to thank our three panelists, Dr. Alison Smith, Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, Alejandra Castillo, and Assistant Director, Erwin Gianchandani, and for your wonderful comments and insights, taking the time to help inform regions and help them do a better job of achieving our national and economic priorities. So with that, I'd just like to ask if we could give our panelists a hand.